This is the Early Conquest lecture. The objectives of this lecture are to understand American civilizations before Spain, why America was discovered by Europeans, the differences between Native American and European cultures and ideas of freedom, Native American views of Europeans, and Europeans' views of Native Americans. American civilizations in the Americas before Spain included Mesoamerica and South America. Mesoamerica consisted of the Olmec, Maya, and Aztec, and the Inca were in South America. This is a map of those civilizations. In the orange is the Olmec, the green Aztec, the pink Maya, and the blue the Inca. The Mesoamerican way of life. Their gods had female and male traits. They performed blood rituals to those gods that demanded blood sacrifices of enemies taken in battle. Their diet was corn or maize. They had a math system, large buildings, a calendar, which predicted the solstice. They had priest astronomers, which helped with harvest planning, weapons, which included volcanic glass, and written language, which was the only one in the Western Hemisphere. The Olmec existed between 1200 and 400 BC, and they were located along the Gulf of Mexico. They had irrigation systems, such as aqueducts. Their diet included maize, which is similar to corn, squash, beans, tomatoes, and fish. They had multiple gods, for example, the rain god and the maize god. They had a trade system. However, that trade system primarily benefited the elite class. The Maya existed between 2000 BCE and 900 CE. They were in Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and Guatemala. They had many compounds for multiple families. They had pyramids. They had large-scale agriculture and abundance of food. In population, they were about 100,000 at its peak. They were a center for trade. They were tied to a city called Teotihuacan. They had a calendar and had perfected the written language. They had a map system for crops and trade. They built city-states. They had over 100 temples, statues of gods, pyramids, and one well-known pyramid was called the Sun Pyramid, which was about 150 feet high. But the Maya civilization declined in 900 CE, primarily due to drought and poor soil. The Aztec originated in approximately 1325 and were located in modern-day Mexico City. The main settlement was the Tenochtitlan. It was about 200,000 in population by 1512. It was considered the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. It was well planned, clean, orderly. It had a trash collection system. It had 2 aqueducts, public buildings, temples, causeways, barges, and floating gardens. Its ruler was Moctezuma, more commonly known as Montezuma, who ruled between 1502 and 1520. During Montezuma's reign, the Aztec Empire reached its largest size. Montezuma was killed during Spain's initial conquest of the Aztec by Hernan Cortez, who was a Spanish conquistador. The settlement included gold. It also had slave labor. and the slaves were from neighboring tribes. The Aztec believed in many gods, including the god of combat, the god of fertility, and the god of farming, etc. The Aztec also believed in human sacrifices to gods. The Inca were located on the South American Pacific coast. They had an advanced road system, which was a stepped road. They had a communication system, which included the Chasquis, which were runners. They had no written language, referred to as the Quipu. They had a diet which consisted of corn, beans, squash, and quinoa. They believed in a sun god, but not in human sacrifice. And they lived off the labor of their peasants. Here is a map of the North American Native American communities in 1500. And as you can see, this is a vast amount of communities that existed during this time period. These communities were widely dispersed. Some were hunters and gatherers, such as the Plains Indians, who also used horses. Others were agricultural communities, such as the Hopewell. There was also the Pueblo, which were located in the southwest. The Pueblo consisted of the Mogollon, the Hohokam, and the Anazi. The Mogollon had art, the Hohokam had pottery and an irrigation system, and the Anazi had cliff homes. The diet of the Hohokam consisted of corn, squash, and beans. The Cahokia was the largest indigenous cultural and population center in North America. They were located in modern-day St. Louis, in the Mississippi Valley. They had mounds and pyramids. The Eastern Woodlands were autonomous clans or tribal units. They were a matriarchal society as opposed to a patriarchal society. In a matriarchal society, the mother is the head of the household instead of the father. The chiefs were generally male, however, they were selected and counseled by women. Women performed the agricultural, such as the farming chores. Men hunted and fished and provided protection. Women passed on traditions, but both men and women raised the children. In the Eastern Woodlands community, they believed in community land, not property ownership. They also believed in a belongingness and kinship, not individualism. There's two main points I want you to understand from this first part of the lecture. The first point is that early American civilizations were advanced. Some had irrigation systems, some had calendars, some had written languages, others were large and had well-planned cities. The second point is that Native American communities will decrease because of internal wars and diseases imposed by European contact. Now let's move on to the Europeans' discovery of America. Prior to the Europeans' discovery of America, this is what the world looked like. We have Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, the Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Middle East. We had Africa, India, China, and so forth. But before we talk about the Europeans' discovery of America, let's talk about who did not discover America and why. First, there was China. China did not discover America because it had little incentive to do so. They didn't need to find anything new. China was wealthy, as opposed to Western Europe, who had land and food shortages. China was a complex culture compared to the Europeans. China had a self-sustaining economy, whereas the European economy was underdeveloped. China had paper money and early forms of printing. They had consumer goods, such as silk, tea, and spices. They invented compasses. They had gunpowder. And their government system was far superior to the Europeans. They also had economic and navigational success. For example, this is an illustration of the Jingyi's treasure fleets. They existed between 1405 and 1433, and they transported consumer goods. Here is a map of Jingyi's voyages. As you can see, these routes are along the eastern side of the world. Next, we have the Ottoman Empire and Islam in West Africa. Neither discovered America. First, let's talk about the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had Arab mariners who were the best in the world. Arabic was a common language of law and commerce. Arabic was a language of government and science. And the Ottoman Empire didn't discover America because it didn't head west, because it was focused on the east, specifically China. It was focused on controlling the trade route in the Persian Gulf, and it believed that the east, not the west, was the key to world power. Next, we have West Africa. West Africa was almost like China in economic importance. However, they were transporting gold. Almost all of the gold in the world was coming from Africa. So why did the Europeans discover America? First, because of European desire for wealth and power, and second, because of international competition. Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa were interconnected in a global economy. Europe was dependent on places like China. America will become a major part of this global connection. When I say Europe, what I mean are the following countries: Spain and Portugal, France, Dutch or Holland, Sweden, and England. I will discuss Spain and Portugal, France, Dutch or Holland, and Sweden in this lecture, and England in separate lectures. I mentioned earlier that Europe was inferior to China and underdeveloped. European countries were backwards, preoccupied with basic survival. They were plagued with internal wars. They were tiny, disorganized, and lacked natural resources. Europeans were peasant farmers and produced only enough to feed their families. Europe was devastated by the bubonic plague, more commonly known as Black Death. They were poor and sickly compared to the rest of the world, and they had no self-controlled economy. They had to trade with each other and compete with each other to acquire wealth and master new maritime and military technology. However, in the 1520s, there was a turning point. They had increased military power, which led to success with accumulation of wealth. And they were also healthier. Spain and Portugal were the first Europeans to expand west. The actors of those explorations were the mariners, or those sailing the ships, the explorers, and businessmen who helped fund the explorations, and royalty, or the crown, such as the king and queen, who also helped funded the explorations and granted permissions for those explorations. Explorations were physically demanding and economically risky. Explorations could take several months or years. Mariners often had to contend with rough seas and challenging weather during these explorations. And many of those mariners got sick and died during the explorations. Explorations were also very expensive. So if these explorations were physically demanding and economically risky, why take them? They took them because they felt it was worth the risk, because it brought them fame and fortune, especially the mariners. So why was Spain and Portugal the first Europeans to expand west? First, it was because of strategies of national consolidations it had already developed. Spain in the early 15th century was not a single nation. It was made up of tribes who spoke different languages. These tribes fought each other for power. And in 1469, Queen Isabel of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon married and brought these two kingdoms together. By 1550, Spain controlled regions more than 10 times the size of Spain. And from 1580 to 1640, Portugal was under Spanish rule. Another reason was because of navigational technology, which helped with exploration. Technology such as caravels. Caravels were ships with special sails made for good wind speed. They also had compasses and quadrants, which were directional tools. Another reason was because it had new types of weapons. These weapons included iron, horses, arquebuses, which were early muskets. However, they mostly used lances and swords and crossbows. These new type of weapons made it easier for them to conquer. Another reason was because of their military organizations. They had what was called the conquistadors. The conquistadors were considered superior fighters. Another reason is that Spanish population was growing. They were simply healthier. When the Spanish reached the Americas, it encountered different Native American tribes. And one of those tribes was the Aztec. If you will remember, I mentioned earlier that the Aztec had a very large empire by the time the Spanish explorers arrived. The reason Spain easily conquered the Native American tribes, including the Aztecs, was because they had new types of weapons, such as the ones I just mentioned, and because of the conquistadors' military strength. The conquistadors and the Aztecs had differing military styles, which is one of the reasons the conquistadors were able to subdue the Aztecs. The conquistadors fought until total victory. They believed that you killed as many as you could to destroy your enemy's ability to fight. The Aztecs had a different military style. They fought until surrender, and then tribute from the warring tribe was paid. They believed that you save as many lives as you could to help you build wealth. This allowed them to establish a larger territory and ultimately a larger empire. The main reasons why Spain settled North America was because of wealth and to spread Catholicism. Remember, Spain had to compete with China and others. Spain settled North America by using control. Spain limited the number of people that could come to its colonies. Spain also placed economic restrictions on its colonies. For example, if you lived in a Spanish colony, you had to buy everything you needed from Spain. This is a way that Spain made money. Few Spanish women migrated to the Spanish colonies. It was mostly men who migrated, and many of those men were conquistadors. Men married Native American women, and they tried to marry Native American women of the highest class possible. Marriage to high-class Native American women helped conquistadors maintain alliances with the highest class of Native Americans. This intermarriage with Native Americans helped Spain maintain supreme power or control. And marriage to Native American women caused an integration of customs, and this integration of customs is called mestizos. Spain also used slave labor to retrieve gold. The conquistadors maintained this control over slaves. They used what's referred to as the encomienda system. This system was a system of power that granted land rights and specific powers to Spanish conquistadors, such as the power to use Native Americans as a slave labor force. And they profited because of this low overhead, meaning they didn't pay slaves. Later, in 1550, the encomienda system was abolished and replaced with the repartimiento system. This system is a system where Indians were legally free and could earn wages, but performed a fixed amount of labor each year. Indians had access to land and could not be bought and sold. However, they still had to work for Spanish landlords, such as the conquistadors, and there were still abuses. The conquistadors sent most of their wealth back to Spain. The bottom line is this: Spain acquired wealth from gold retrieved by the slave labor. It also acquired wealth from the colonists who had to buy everything from Spain. Spain also explored North America. I'm only going to mention a few. I'm not going to go into detail. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo explored the Pacific coast up to Oregon during the 1530s and 1540s. Hernando de Soto, Capaz de Vaca, and Francisco Vasquez de Coronado explored the Gulf and Southwest. Florida was explored by Ponce de Leon in 1513. The first colony in Florida was established in 1565. It became a military post to guard against pirates taking their gold and silver. Not a lot of settlers lived there. Spain also wanted Florida to guard against French invasions. Pedro Menendez de Villas led a colonizing expedition to Florida and destroyed the French Huguenots, then established a Spanish fort called St. Augustine. Juan de Oñate led an expedition from Mexico to modern-day New Mexico in 1598 and tried to establish a permanent settlement. There he encountered the Acoma Pueblo Indians. Oñate's nephew and others were killed. Oñate killed a large number of the Pueblo, then captured and enslaved them. He maimed the adult men by cutting off one of their feet. Oñate was later sent back to Spain for cruel treatment of the Pueblo. The relationship between the Spanish and the Pueblo Indians deteriorated, and this erupted into a Pueblo revolt. And it was mostly because of the continuous exploitation of Indians by the Spanish, and also because of the Spanish efforts to convert Indians to Catholicism. They used intimidation and violence to do both. However, Spain underestimated the Pueblo, and they led a revolt against the Spanish. They destroyed farms and missions, killed missionaries, and the remaining Spanish and Christian Indians fled. This was an apparent victory by the Pueblo. And it's significant because it was the only North American expulsion of settlers by Indians. However, this will be fleeting, and Spain will reconquer New Mexico in 1692. Now let's move on to New France. New France was located in the Canadian regions. More specifically, they were located in what's considered the southern border of eastern Canada and the northern border of eastern US. So why was New France established? During the 1500s, there was a religious upheaval in Europe. It was called the Protestant Reformation. And put simply, it was a battle between Protestants and Catholics. There were a number of people living in Europe at that time that were looking for a place where Catholics and Protestants could live in peace. And that place was New France. New France's economic source was fur trading. There was a French fur trader company that was established in North America in this area in the early 1500s. French fur traders traded with Indians for beaver pelts. And at the time, there was no demand for beaver fur in France. This created a market for beaver fur hats. It also created a fashion for beaver fur hats for men. The Catholics and Protestants lived together in harmony until about 1625, until the French colony decreed that only Catholicism could exist in New France. It was then that French colonists wanted Indians to convert to Catholicism. So they sent thousands of priests to New France to convert the Indians to Catholicism. Once Indians were converted to Catholicism, they could still be independent and not enslaved. They could still maintain their culture and their practices. This is one difference between New France and Spanish colonies, is that in Spanish colonies, the Indians could not maintain their own culture and practices. Also in New France, there was something called maitis, which is a mixing of cultures and societies. French intermarried with local women. French learned Indian cultures, and vice versa. New France was considered a place where the most humane treatment of Indians by European colonists occurred. The French treated Indians well because they wanted to be wealthy, and they were also dependent on them for survival and protection. And in a way, both sides benefited from this relationship. There was no unfair advantage. So there was harmonious relationship between the Native Americans and the French. Also in New France, there was something called the Middle Ground. This was not just a geographic area. This was an area where cultures connected or came together, where the French cultures and the Indian cultures connected and came together. Eventually, the Native Americans' hunting of fur began to affect the beaver population. Anytime that you have a population of something and then it's overhunted, then that decreases that population. This led to the decline in the beaver pelt trade. Let's move on to the New Netherlands. The New Netherlands was settled in New York by a private company called the Dutch East India Company and explored by an Englishman by the name of Hudson. Its economic resource was fur trade, similar to New France. It was religiously diverse, including Catholics, Jews, and Protestants. It was established as a trading post, not a colony. It was established as a trading post because the Dutch weren't interested in colonizing North America, because they had successful colonies in Africa, South America, India, Indonesia, and China. New Netherlands had no political structure. As I said, they were only interested in establishing a trading post. They allied with the Iroquois, which is similar to New France. Their trading post was controlled by appointees of the Dutch East India Company. They had a governor, but not an elected assembly or town council. Their labor system consisted of slaves. By 1650, they had about 500 slaves. Their slaves paid an annual fee to the company and worked when they were called. Slaves were given land to support their families. Slaves worked on family farms and households, not plantations. With respect to gender relationships, married women retained a separate legal identity, meaning they could go to court, they could borrow money, and own property. In fact, husbands shared property with their wives. They had humane treatment of Indians. For example, they didn't allow settlement of Indian lands by settlers without those settlers purchasing that land from the Indians. This was similar to New France with respect to having humane treatment. Finally, New Sweden. I'm not going to say much about New Sweden other than the following. They were located in the Delaware Valley. Their economic resource was hunting wild game and fishing, and they sold those products in Sweden. With respect to their labor system, they imported a few slaves, but not very many. They were very religiously diverse, and they became part of the New Netherlands, but that didn't last long. Native Americans and Europeans will have many conflicts in American history, particularly in early American history. And to understand those conflicts, you need to understand their differences. With respect to the ideas of freedom, Native Americans' ideas of freedom included community belongingness, kinship, and group autonomy. They didn't believe in individual ownership of land, just community land. As opposed to the Europeans, whose ideas of freedom was about individual freedom and land ownership. For Europeans, land ownership was a way of achieving freedom. Native American views of Europeans is that Europeans were traders and not permanent settlers, particularly with respect to the coastal Indians on the eastern side of the U.S. Most of their encounters early on had been with Europeans that traded with them, not Europeans that were going to permanently settle on their land or near their land. Europeans' views of Native Americans. Europeans thought Native Americans were uncivilized, savages, that they were not Christian because they believed in gods and in inanimate objects, such as the maize god or the rain god. They believed that Native American males were weak because the women Native Americans were the ones who were doing the agriculture, who were doing the farming. In European culture, it was the men who were doing the agriculture and the farming. In fact, they thought that these males were mistreating females because the women were doing the agriculture. They didn't understand the role of Native American males, such as them providing protection and doing the hunting and gathering. And hunting and gathering is not necessarily a year-long job. And ultimately, Europeans thought they were superior to the Native Americans. Here are the conclusions or some of the main points that I wanted you to get out of this lecture. This is a chart that shows the differences between Spain, New France, the New Netherlands, and New Sweden. For example, the reason that they settled. Spain settled the Americas because of money and to spread Catholicism. New France, because they were looking for a place where Protestants and Catholics could live in peace. The New Netherlands were looking for just a trading post. And the New Sweden settled America for wealth. Labor, Spain had slaves, specifically the Native Americans. They had the encomienda system and the repartimiento system. New Netherlands had some slaves, but not that many, about 500 or so. They had black slaves, not plantation slaves. And the New Sweden had very few slaves. With respect to economic source, Spain had gold. I didn't mention silver during the lecture, but they also had silver. New France had the fur trade. The New Netherlands also had the fur trade. And New Sweden had wild game and fish. With respect to cultures and Indian treatment, Spain had intermarriage and enslaved their Indians. New France had intermarriage. We talked about Maitis, middle ground. They treated the Indians humanely. They did not enslave them. They lived harmoniously with them. And initially, Catholics and Protestants lived harmoniously together. New Netherlands had diverse religion, such as Catholics, Jews, and Protestants. They allied with the Iroquois. Slaves were given land to support families. They treated them humanely. They treated, in particular, Indians. They were religiously diverse. With respect to gender relationships, Spain had very few women from Spain that came to the Americas, at least initially. The New Netherlands, married women retained a separate legal identity. Now the big picture. These are really the big ideas that I want you to get from this lecture. First, the Europeans and Native Americans had differing views of each other, which will create conflict between the two throughout the development of the colonies. And then second, this conflict will also influence the development of America politically, economically, and socially. And we will talk about some of those things later on in the course. Okay, that ends today's lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.